The small roadside bar sat just outside of town, the kind of place truckers and travelers stopped by to rest for a while. It wasn't fancy, but it had a warm glow inside. Old wooden tables, a jukebox that sometimes skipped, and a few regulars who came by every evening. The smell of grilled food mixed with the sound of laughter and country music. It was the kind of place where people told stories, shared problems, or simply sat quietly with a drink. That night, just before sunset, the door opened with a creak. A tall man stepped inside, his leather jacket dripping from the light rain outside. The place went a bit quiet as everyone turned to look. He was a biker, rough around the edges, boots heavy, hair a little messy, face serious. He didn't look like someone who smiled often. He walked in slowly, his boots echoing against the wooden floor, and took a seat in the corner without saying a word. The waitress, who had been cleaning a table near the counter, noticed him. She gave a polite smile and grabbed a menu, walking over with practiced ease. "Evening," she said softly. "What can I get you?" He looked up, his voice deep but calm. "Just coffee," he said. She nodded. "You got it." He watched her walk back to the counter. She moved fast, clearly used to busy nights. Her hair was tied up, and there was a tired look in her eyes that told a story of long hours and too little rest. She poured his coffee and brought it over, placing it gently on the table. "Need anything else?" she asked. He shook his head. "This'll do." The waitress smiled, then walked off to serve another table. The biker sat quietly, hands wrapped around the warm cup, staring out the window where the rain slid down in thin silver lines. The reflection of neon lights flickered across his face. He wasn't there to cause trouble. In fact, he didn't seem like he wanted to be noticed at all, but people noticed him anyway. At one table, two men whispered to each other, glancing his way. At another, a group of regulars kept their eyes on him, maybe just curious, maybe cautious. In small towns, new faces always drew attention, especially ones that looked like they'd seen too much of the world. The waitress, meanwhile, went back to work, pretending not to notice the stares or the tired ache in her legs. She'd been working double shifts all week. The bar owner had been short-staffed, and she needed the money. Rent was late, her car barely started that morning, and her younger brother had called earlier asking for help with his school fees. She didn't have the heart to tell him she didn't know how she'd manage it yet. Still, she smiled through it all. The rude customers, the spilled drinks, the endless noise. Because smiling was easier than explaining why she wanted to cry some nights. The biker sat quietly for nearly an hour. He didn't talk to anyone, just drank his coffee and occasionally glanced around the room. He noticed the waitress each time she passed, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but as if he was studying something familiar in her, something that reminded him of someone he once knew. Later that evening, a few loud customers came in, a group of men who had clearly already been drinking before they arrived. They were laughing too loudly, bumping into tables, calling out for beer before they'd even sat down. The waitress sighed quietly but went over with a polite tone. She took their order, keeping her smile in place even when one of them joked too harshly. The biker watched from his corner. He saw the way she handled them, calm, patient, never raising her voice. She moved with quiet strength, the kind that comes from having to hold yourself together even when the world keeps testing you. As the night went on, the bar filled up more. Music played louder, people laughed, and the sound of glasses clinking filled the room. The waitress kept moving from table to table, her feet barely getting a break. When she passed by the biker again, he looked up. "You look tired," he said simply. She gave a small laugh. "That obvious?" He nodded slightly. "It's part of the job," she said. "People come here to forget their problems for a bit. Someone has to make it easy for them." He studied her for a second before replying. "And who helps you forget yours?" She paused, not expecting the question. For a moment, she didn't have an answer. Then she smiled faintly. "Coffee, sometimes music. Sometimes I just keep going." He gave a small nod as if he understood exactly what she meant. Before she could say more, someone called her name from the other side of the bar, and she hurried off. The biker sat back watching her move, and something in his chest tightened a little. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because he'd seen that same kind of tired bravery before. In his mother, maybe. Or in the faces of people who had no choice but to keep pushing forward. As the clock ticked toward midnight, the bar started to quiet down again. Some customers left, others stayed for one last drink. The biker was still there, nursing his second cup of coffee. The waitress wiped down tables, humming softly under her breath. The storm outside had stopped, leaving the air heavy and still. Then the door swung open again. 3 men walked in, strangers, rough-looking, with the smell of alcohol following them. The bartender sighed but said nothing. The waitress went over, her smile polite but cautious. "What can I get you?" she asked. One of the men leaned too close, grinning in a way that made her uncomfortable. "You maybe," he said, and his friends laughed. She forced a small laugh, trying to diffuse it. "How about something from the menu instead?" she said lightly. They ordered beers, still laughing among themselves. The biker's eyes narrowed slightly, but he stayed silent. When she brought their drinks, one of them brushed her arm on purpose. She stepped back quickly, pretending it didn't bother her, and went back to the counter. The biker saw it. He saw everything. The men kept talking loudly, making jokes, getting noisier with each drink. A few other customers started glancing their way but didn't step in. The waitress avoided their table as much as she could, but every time she walked past, one of them made another comment. The biker's jaw tightened. He didn't move yet. Not until one of the men stood up and blocked her path near the counter. "Hey, sweetheart," he said. "You dropped something." She frowned, confused. "What?" "This," he said, pointing to the floor, then laughing when she looked down. His hand brushed her sleeve again. She pulled back, clearly uncomfortable now. "Please don't do that," she said quietly, but he didn't stop. Before anyone else could react, the biker stood up. The wooden chair creaked loudly behind him. The room went quiet. The men turned around, surprised. The biker's face was calm, but there was something in his eyes, something that made people think twice before saying another word. He walked toward them slowly, each step steady. The waitress's eyes widened slightly, unsure of what would happen next. The men tried to act tough, but one of them took a small step back. The biker stopped right in front of them, silent for a few seconds. The music from the jukebox hummed softly in the background. "You should leave her alone," he said finally, his voice low and even. The man closest to him smirked. "And who are you supposed to be?" The biker didn't answer. He just stared, and the silence that followed was heavier than any words. One of the men laughed nervously, muttering something under his breath, but the waitress quickly stepped between them. "It's fine," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Please, it's okay." The biker looked at her, then at the men again. His hand rested on the edge of the table, but he didn't make a move. He wasn't there to fight. He just wanted them to stop. After a long, tense moment, the man scoffed and stepped back. "Whatever," he muttered. "We're just having fun." The biker didn't blink. "Then have fun somewhere else," he said quietly. The men looked at each other, muttered a few curses, and finally walked out, slamming the door behind them. The bar was silent again. The waitress let out a shaky breath. She turned to the biker. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. He looked at her. "Yeah, I did." For a moment she didn't know what to say. Then she gave a small, tired smile. "Thank you." He nodded once and went back to his seat. The waitress walked behind the counter, her hands trembling slightly as she poured herself a glass of water. The biker watched quietly, then went back to staring out the window. No one else in the bar spoke for a while. The rain started again outside, soft and steady, and that was how it began. One quiet night, in a small bar at the edge of town, where a biker and a tired waitress crossed paths without knowing that one small moment would change both of their lives in ways neither of them could imagine. The next evening, the small bar was quieter than usual. The rain had returned, tapping softly against the windows. The waitress stood behind the counter, wiping down glasses and pretending to focus on her work. But her thoughts kept drifting back to the night before, to the biker who had stepped in when those men wouldn't leave her alone. She hadn't even caught his name. He had left quietly, as if what he'd done wasn't a big deal. But to her it was. Most people would have looked away. He hadn't. That kind of quiet courage was rare. She looked toward the corner where he had sat the night before. The chair was empty. Part of her felt relieved. The memory of that tense moment still made her heart race. But another part of her hoped he might walk in again. Not because she needed help, but because there was something about his calm presence that made her feel safe. The bell over the door jingled suddenly. She turned, expecting another group of travelers or maybe a few locals. But there he was again. The biker. Same leather jacket, same calm face. He walked in like someone used to long roads and silence. She tried not to smile too much, but her heart lifted a little. "Coffee?" she asked when he reached the counter. He nodded. "Black, like last time." She poured it quickly and placed the cup in front of him. "You back through town already?" "Guess so," he said quietly. "Didn't finish my ride yesterday." She leaned against the counter for a second. "Thanks again. For what you did last night." He looked up, his expression unreadable. Anyone would have done the same. She shook her head slightly. "Not really. Most people would have pretended not to see." He didn't respond right away, just took a slow sip of his coffee. "Maybe," he said finally. "But sometimes doing nothing costs more." Those words stayed with her. She wanted to ask what he meant, but something about his tone told her not to push. He looked like a man carrying more stories than he was ready to tell. The bar stayed quiet for a while. The jukebox played a soft tune, and the few customers who were there spoke in low voices. The waitress moved around the room, taking orders, cleaning tables, always aware of the biker sitting quietly in the corner. Every now and then she caught him glancing around, not suspiciously, but like someone who noticed everything. A few hours later, the dinner rush started. The bar filled up with locals coming in after work. The waitress was moving quickly between tables when she felt someone tug at her sleeve. It was an older woman sitting near the window, smiling kindly. "Sweetheart, that man over there, is he with anyone?" she asked, nodding toward the biker. The waitress smiled politely. "No, ma'am. He's just a customer," the woman chuckled. "He looks like he's got a story to tell." The waitress laughed softly. "I think he has more than one." She turned back toward the counter and caught the biker watching her. It wasn't an uncomfortable stare, more like quiet observation. She smiled faintly and he looked away, pretending to study his cup. Later that night, when the rush slowed down, the waitress brought him a refill without him asking. "On the house," she said with a small grin. He frowned slightly. "Why?" "Because most people don't make this job easier," she said. "You did." He looked at her for a long moment, then gave a faint nod. "Thanks." For a while, neither of them spoke. The rain outside grew heavier and thunder rolled in the distance. The other customers started leaving one by one until only a few remained. The waitress began wiping tables again when the biker suddenly stood. "You should close early," he said quietly. She looked at him, confused. "Why?" He tilted his head toward the window. "Storm's getting worse. Roads are flooding already." She glanced outside. He was right. The parking lot was shiny with water and the wind was starting to howl. "Guess it's just another long night," she said, trying to sound light. He didn't smile, but his eyes softened. "You live far?" "About 10 minutes down the road," she said. "Old house near the edge of town?" He nodded slowly. "You got someone waiting?" She hesitated. "My little brother. He's probably asleep by now." The biker's face changed slightly, not with pity but understanding. "How old?" 13, she said. "I take care of him. Our parents passed a few years ago." He nodded again quietly. "That's not easy." She smiled faintly. "No, but he's a good kid. He's the reason I keep going." There was a silence between them after that, the kind that wasn't awkward, just real. The storm outside grew louder, rain slapping against the windows like handfuls of gravel. One of the lights flickered near the counter. The biker looked around, scanning the place like someone who always stayed alert. Suddenly, the front door burst open. A man stumbled in, soaked from the rain, mumbling something under his breath. The waitress rushed over. "Sir, are you okay?" The man looked up, shivering. "Truck broke down," he said. "Road's a mess. You got a phone?" She pointed toward the payphone near the restrooms. "Right over there." The man nodded, said thanks, and hurried off. When she turned back, the biker was standing again, scanning the window. The waitress frowned. "Everything all right?" He nodded slightly but didn't sit down again. "Storm like this brings all kinds of people out." She gave him a curious look. "You mean trouble?" "Sometimes," he said simply. She wasn't sure what he meant, but there was something about the way he said it that made her trust him anyway. Minutes passed. The rain didn't stop and the lights flickered again. The man using the payphone hung up and came to the counter. "No answer," he said. "Guess I'll wait here a bit if that's okay." "Of course," the waitress said. You can sit anywhere. He nodded and took a seat. The biker kept watching him for a moment, then finally relaxed a bit. The waitress tried to focus on cleaning, but she couldn't ignore the small sense of unease that had settled in the room. Maybe it was the storm, or maybe it was the strange quiet between thunderclaps. Then the lights went out. The room went completely dark, except for the faint glow of lightning flashing through the windows. Someone cursed softly. The waitress froze. "Oh no," she whispered. "Not again." The biker's voice came steady from the corner. "You got candles?" "Yeah," she said quickly. "Behind the counter." He walked over calmly, using the small light from his phone to help her find them. When she struck a match and lit the first candle, their faces flickered in the glow, his steady, hers anxious but trying to stay calm. The storm howled louder outside. "Power usually comes back fast," she said, though her tone wasn't convincing. He nodded, placing the candle on the counter. "You want me to stick around till it does?" She looked at him surprised. "You don't have to." "I know," he said quietly, "but maybe I should." Something about the way he said it made her chest tighten slightly. Not from fear, but comfort. She nodded. "Thanks." They sat in silence for a while. The biker leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching the rain. The waitress sat on a stool, rubbing her tired hands. After a while, she broke the silence. "You travel a lot, don't you?" He nodded. "Most of the time." "Why?" He thought for a moment. "Sometimes it's easier to keep moving than to stay in one place." She studied him, realizing there was sadness behind his calm face. "You running from something?" she asked gently. He gave a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe from myself." She didn't ask more. Some stories didn't need questions. The storm began to fade slowly, the thunder moving farther away. The candles flickered softly as the wind eased. For the first time that night, the bar felt peaceful again. The biker finished his coffee and set the cup down. "Looks like it's clearing up," he said. The waitress nodded. "You heading out?" He glanced outside, then back at her. "Maybe I'll wait till morning. Roads will be better by then." "You can stay here if you need to," she offered. "There's a small storage room in the back with a couch. It's not much, but it's dry." He hesitated. "You sure?" She nodded. "You helped me last night. It's the least I can do." He gave a small nod of thanks. "All right." She showed him the small room behind the kitchen. Old couch, a blanket, and the faint smell of coffee beans from the next room. "Sorry it's not fancy," she said. "It's perfect," he replied simply. Before she turned to leave, she said quietly, "I never got your name." He paused, then said, "Call me whatever you want." "Doesn't matter much," she smiled softly. "All right, mystery man." He gave the faintest hint of a grin, then sat down on the couch as she closed the door behind her. That night, as the storm faded and the first light of dawn started to touch the sky, the biker lay awake, listening to the sound of rain dripping from the roof. For the first time in a long while, he felt a strange kind of peace. He didn't know why he'd stopped in that bar 2 nights in a row. Maybe it was luck. Maybe it was something else. But deep down, he knew this quiet place and the tired waitress had already started to change something inside him. Something he thought he'd lost long ago. And somewhere out front, the waitress sat at the counter, the biker's jacket folded neatly beside her. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she felt for the first time in months that she wasn't alone in her story anymore. The morning sun pushed through the clouds slowly, turning the sky pale gold. The storm had passed, but the ground outside the bar was soaked. Water dripped from the roof and puddles reflected the soft light of dawn. Inside, the smell of coffee filled the air again. The waitress stood behind the counter, her hair tied up, wearing the same tired smile she always had. She hadn't slept much. Every time she closed her eyes, her thoughts drifted back to the biker sleeping in the storage room. It was strange. She barely knew him, yet something about his quiet presence made her feel at ease. When she peeked in to check on him, he was already awake, sitting on the couch and tying his boots. He looked up when she opened the door.
"Morning," she said softly. He nodded.
"Didn't mean to sleep in." "It's fine," she replied. "You earned it after that storm." He stood, stretching slightly, his jacket folded neatly on the armrest. "Thanks for letting me stay," she smiled. "Least I could do." He started toward the door but paused when he noticed a picture hanging near the counter. An old photo of her and a younger boy, both smiling awkwardly. He pointed to it. Your brother? She nodded, her eyes softening. Yeah, that was his first day of middle school. He looks like a good kid. He is, she said with a hint of pride. He's the reason I keep this place running. Well, the reason I keep working here, at least. He nodded. You're doing right by him, she smiled faintly. Trying to. Some days it feels like running in circles. The biker looked like he wanted to say something but didn't. Instead, he reached for his jacket. I should hit the road, he said. You sure? She asked. The roads are still wet. I've been through worse, he said with a faint smile. She hesitated, then said, You'll come back, right? He looked at her for a moment, the corner of his mouth turning slightly upward. Maybe, she nodded, pretending not to look disappointed. Ride safe, all right? He gave a small nod and stepped out into the morning air. The sound of his motorcycle starting echoed through the quiet parking lot. She watched him ride away until he disappeared beyond the trees. For the rest of the day, she couldn't stop thinking about him. It wasn't romantic, not yet at least. It was more like she felt connected to him in a way she couldn't explain. Maybe because he'd seen her on one of her worst nights and hadn't judged her for it. Days turned into weeks. The biker didn't come back and life went on as usual. The bar filled up every evening with regulars and travelers. The waitress smiled, took orders, and laughed at jokes she didn't find funny. But somewhere deep down she missed the quiet presence of the man who didn't talk much but somehow made her feel seen. One late afternoon, while cleaning the counter, she heard the low rumble of a motorcycle outside. Her heart skipped. She tried not to look too eager, but when the door opened and he walked in, she couldn't help but smile. You're back, she said, trying to sound casual. He nodded, taking off his gloves. Coffee? Of course, she said. I was starting to think you got lost. He smirked slightly. Almost did. She poured his coffee and leaned on the counter. So what brings you back? He looked around for a moment, then said quietly, Guess I needed a place that felt real for a while. Her smile softened. Well, you found it. The two of them settled into a quiet rhythm over the next few days. He came in every evening, sitting at the same corner table. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they didn't. But every time it felt easy, like they didn't need to fill the silence to understand each other. One evening, the waitress brought him his coffee and noticed a small scar on his hand. That looks old, she said gently. He glanced down. It is. From a fight? He paused, then nodded, sort of. From a time I thought fighting solved everything. She looked at him for a moment, then said quietly, Guess we've both learned the hard way that it doesn't. He gave a faint nod. Yeah, it doesn't. The bar was quiet that night. The regulars had left early and only a few travelers remained. Outside, the wind carried the sound of distant traffic. Inside, the waitress and the biker found themselves talking longer than usual. She told him about her brother, how she'd taken care of him since their parents died in an accident, how hard it was balancing work and bills, how she sometimes felt like she was failing but couldn't stop trying. He listened quietly, never interrupting, just nodding when she spoke. When she finally fell silent, he said, You're stronger than you think. She gave a tired smile. Doesn't always feel that way. He looked at her for a long moment. It never does. The next night he showed up again, but something about his mood was different. He looked heavier, distracted. She noticed it right away. Everything all right? She asked softly. He hesitated. Had a call earlier. Someone I used to ride with. Got into an accident. I'm sorry, she said. He nodded slowly. He'll be fine. But it makes you think. She leaned against the counter. About what? He looked down into his cup. How fast things can change. 1 minute you're on the road, next minute you're gone. Makes you wonder what's left behind. She didn't say anything at first. Then after a moment she said softly, Sometimes what's left behind isn't about things. It's about how you made people feel while you were here. He looked up and their eyes met. There was something in her voice, a quiet honesty, the kind that hit deeper than big speeches ever could. He nodded slowly. Maybe you're right. The night stretched on. They didn't talk much after that, but there was a kind of peace in the silence between them. Later, when the last customer left, the waitress started wiping down the counter. The biker stood to leave but noticed her struggling to lift one of the heavy crates behind the bar. Without a word, he walked over and helped her move it. "Thanks," she said with a small laugh. "Guess I should have waited till morning." He shrugged. "You'd have done it anyway." "You sound like you know me," she said playfully. He looked at her, a hint of warmth in his eyes. "Maybe I do." She laughed softly, and for a moment they just stood there, the air between them calm and easy. Before he left that night, she handed him a small paper bag. "Here," she said. "Made extra dinner earlier. It's nothing fancy, but it's better than diner food." He looked at the bag, surprised. "You didn't have to." "I know," she said with a smile. "But I wanted to." He nodded slowly. "Thanks." She watched him go again, his motorcycle disappearing into the dark. The night felt a little quieter after he left. The next few days passed quickly. He kept coming back, always at the same time, always sitting at the same table. He started helping her out without being asked, fixing a broken light switch, carrying heavy boxes, even repairing the jukebox when it jammed. The regulars started noticing. One of them joked, "Looks like you've got yourself a new handyman." The waitress laughed it off, but deep down she didn't mind. She liked having him around. The bar felt safer, quieter. One night, while they were closing up, she finally asked the question she'd been holding back. "You never told me why you started writing." He looked thoughtful. "Freedom, I guess. When you're on the road, everything behind you feels smaller. You stop thinking about what went wrong." "And what did?" she asked softly. He didn't answer right away. Then he said quietly, "Family. Lost them a long time ago. Haven't been the same since." She didn't say she was sorry, and she could see that he didn't want pity. Instead, she said, "Maybe you were meant to find new people. Different kind of family." He looked at her and for the first time really smiled. Not the small kind, but one that reached his eyes. Maybe. When he left that night, the air outside was cool and quiet. The waitress locked up the bar and stood by the door for a while, watching the empty road. She couldn't explain it, but she felt that something had started to change. For both of them. The biker had come into her life by accident, but now it felt like there was a reason. They were two people who had lost things they couldn't replace, yet somehow, they'd found a small piece of peace in each other's company. Neither of them said it out loud, but both knew it deep down. This connection wasn't just a passing moment. It was the start of something they both needed, even if they didn't yet understand why. The days began to blend together after that. The biker became a familiar sight in the little bar, not as a stranger anymore, but as someone who felt like part of the place. He would come in at sunset, order his coffee, and sometimes stay until closing time. The waitress had stopped pretending she didn't look forward to his visits. The regulars had gotten used to seeing him too. Some of them even started talking to him, asking about his bike or where he'd been. He never shared much, but he was polite, always giving short, calm answers. And when the occasional loud customer got too rough with words, he didn't need to say a thing. A quiet glance from him was enough to calm the whole room. One Friday evening, the bar was busier than usual. A group of travelers had stopped by on their way through town. Laughter filled the air, and the sound of clinking glasses mixed with the music from the old jukebox. The waitress was rushing between tables, smiling and chatting, but she felt tired. Her hands ached from carrying trays and her feet burned from standing all day. The biker sat in his usual corner, watching the crowd quietly. Every time she passed by, she gave him a small smile. He noticed the way she rubbed her wrist between orders, the small signs of exhaustion she tried to hide. After a while, he stood up and walked to the counter. "You need a break," he said softly when she passed him another plate. She smiled. "Can't, we're short-staffed tonight." "Then let me help," he offered. She shook her head. "You're a customer," he smiled faintly. "Doesn't mean I can't carry a few plates." Before she could argue, he grabbed a tray and followed her around, taking orders to the tables. The regulars laughed and teased him. "Didn't know we hired a new waiter." But the mood stayed light. The waitress tried not to show it, but she was grateful. By the time the crowd started thinning out, it was almost midnight. The last group of travelers left, leaving behind empty glasses and soft music humming from the jukebox. The waitress leaned against the counter, stretching her sore back. "You're gonna wear yourself out one of these days," the biker said as he wiped down a table. She chuckled tiredly. "That's the plan, I guess." He looked at her. Doesn't sound like much of a plan. She gave him a small smile. You got a better one? Maybe start by sleeping more than 4 hours a night, he said. She laughed. You sound like my brother. Smart kid then, he said, putting the last chair up on the table. She watched him for a moment, then said quietly, You don't talk much about yourself, do you? He shrugged. Not much to tell. I don't believe that, she said. Everyone's got a story. He hesitated, then said softly, Maybe someday. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was warm, like they both understood that not everything needed to be said right away. Later that night, when the bar was quiet and the lights dimmed, the waitress sat by the window, staring out at the empty road. The biker stood near the door, ready to leave. Road looks dark tonight, she said. It always does, he replied. Then why ride it? She asked. He thought for a moment. Because if you stop moving, you start thinking, and some thoughts are better left behind. She nodded slowly, understanding more than he probably realized. I get that. He gave her a small nod before stepping out into the cool night air. The roar of his motorcycle echoed briefly before fading into silence. When he didn't show up for 2 days, she told herself not to worry. Maybe he'd gone on a ride. Maybe he needed time. But on the 3rd day, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. By evening, she was standing by the bar door, looking out every few minutes, hoping to hear the sound of his bike. When the clock hit midnight and he still hadn't come, she locked up slowly, trying not to feel disappointed. The next morning, as she opened the bar, she noticed something outside, a small envelope taped to the door. Her heart skipped. She pulled it down and opened it carefully. Inside was a folded piece of paper with a short note written in simple handwriting. Had to take care of something out of town. Didn't want you to worry. I'll be back soon, she smiled, relief washing over her. But at the bottom of the note there was something else. A small worn photograph tucked inside. It showed a man standing next to a woman and a little boy, all smiling beside a motorcycle. The man in the picture was younger, but there was no mistaking him. She held the photo for a long moment, realizing this was the piece of his story he hadn't told yet. Over the next week, she found herself looking at that photo whenever she missed him. She wondered who they were. His family, most likely. The way he'd talked about loss now made more sense. One evening, a storm rolled back into town. The wind howled against the windows and thunder shook the old bar. She was closing early when she heard the familiar sound of a motorcycle engine cutting through the rain. Her heart jumped as she rushed to the door. He walked in, drenched, tired, but smiling faintly. You're back, she said, relief in her voice. And told you I would be, he said, shaking off his jacket. She handed him a towel. You could have called. No signal out there, he replied. And besides, didn't want to worry you more than I already did. She crossed her arms, pretending to be annoyed. You think that makes it better? He smiled. Maybe not. She sighed, then smiled too. Coffee? Always. As she poured him a cup, she noticed he looked different. Not physically, but something in his eyes had changed. Softer somehow, quieter. You okay? She asked. He nodded slowly. Yeah, just been thinking. About what? He looked down at his hands. About how long I've been running. She didn't say anything, waiting for him to continue. I went back to my hometown, he said finally. Haven't been there in years. Visited the place where my family's buried. Her expression softened. That must have been hard, he nodded. It was, but I needed it. Needed to stop pretending the past wasn't still chasing me. She reached out, gently touching his hand. Maybe it's time you stop running. He looked at her for a long moment. And stay here? She smiled softly. You could. No one's forcing you to leave. He didn't answer, but the way he looked at her said more than words could. For the first time, he seemed like he was thinking about staying. Not because he had nowhere else to go, but because he'd finally found somewhere that felt right. That night, after the rain stopped, they stepped outside together. The air was cool and fresh, and the sky was beginning to clear. The streetlights reflected off the wet pavement, making everything shimmer. He looked at the road stretching into the distance, then back at the small bar behind them. You ever think about leaving this place? He asked. Sometimes, she said honestly, but every time I think about it, I realize there's nowhere else that feels like home. He nodded slowly, taking in her words. Home, he repeated quietly. They stood there for a long moment, the silence between them soft and full. Then he said, "Maybe it's time I find one again." She smiled. "You already have. You just don't know it yet." He looked at her, and in that moment he knew she was right. The road had given him freedom, but it had also kept him alone. Now for the first time in years he didn't feel like he needed to run anymore. The lights from the bar glowed warmly behind them, and the night air carried the faint scent of rain and coffee. The world felt small, but in the best way, like it had finally given two lost souls a place to rest. Inside, the jukebox played a slow tune, soft and steady. The waitress leaned against the doorframe, watching the biker as he stood by his motorcycle, lost in thought. When he finally looked back at her, there was something peaceful in his eyes, something that hadn't been there before. He didn't say a word, but he didn't need to. She understood. He was home. The following weeks passed quietly, like a calm after a long storm. The biker didn't ride away this time. His motorcycle stayed parked outside the bar, a familiar sight that made everyone in town smile a little when they drove past. He still wore his old leather jacket, still moved with that quiet strength, but something about him had softened. The waitress noticed it the most. He talked more now, laughed a little, even joined the regulars when they joked around. But every so often she'd catch him staring out the window, lost in thought. She never interrupted those moments. She just let him be. One morning, the bar was nearly empty. The sun streamed through the windows and the sound of birds mixed with the soft hum of the refrigerator. The biker sat at his usual corner, sipping his coffee. The waitress came over with a plate of breakfast. "You know," she said, setting it down. "You've been here so long I might start charging you rent." He smiled faintly. "Guess I'll have to work for it then." "You already do," she said, glancing at the light bulb he'd fixed that morning. He chuckled softly. "Fair enough." There was a pause before she said quietly, "You ever miss the road?" He thought for a moment, then said, "Sometimes, but I think I was riding to get somewhere I didn't even know I was looking for. Maybe this was it." She didn't say anything for a few seconds, just looked at him with a small knowing smile. "Well, I'm glad you found it." He nodded, his eyes soft. "Yeah, me too." The door opened suddenly and a man in a delivery uniform stepped inside. He dropped off a few boxes and nodded politely before leaving. The waitress bent down to check the inventory papers, muttering under her breath about a missing receipt. The biker watched her for a moment, the way she focused on every detail, the care she took in everything she did. She looked up suddenly. "You staring again?" she teased. He smirked. Maybe. She laughed. "You're terrible at pretending." He grinned. "Guess I'm out of practice." She shook her head with a smile and went back to sorting the boxes. That night, the bar was busy again. The locals filled the tables, talking and laughing loudly. A country song played on the jukebox and the smell of grilled food filled the air. The waitress was moving fast, trying to keep up with the rush. The biker, as always, stayed near the counter, helping her when things got too hectic. At one point, a group of travelers came in, loud, friendly, already half drunk. They took a big table near the back, ordering round after round. One of them, a big man with a leather vest, kept watching the waitress as she worked. The biker noticed but didn't say anything. He'd seen that kind of look before, careless, thoughtless. When the waitress walked past their table with a tray, one of the men cracked a joke that made the others laugh. She smiled politely, pretending not to hear. But as she turned, the man reached out suddenly and tugged at the back of her shirt. The room went silent. The waitress froze, her face flushing red. The biker stood up so fast his chair scraped the floor. For a long second, nobody moved. Then he walked over slowly, his expression calm but unreadable. The man at the table tried to laugh it off. "Hey, relax, it was just a joke." Before he could finish, the biker reached out and took hold of the man's wrist. He didn't squeeze hard, just firm enough to make him stop. "Apologize," he said quietly. The man's smile faded. "I said it was a joke." The biker's voice stayed calm, but his eyes were sharp. "Then say sorry." To her, everyone in the bar was silent, watching. The waitress stood still, her hands trembling slightly. The man looked at her, then back at the biker, and finally muttered, "All right, sorry." The biker released his wrist and stepped back. "Good," he said simply. Then he turned to the waitress. "You okay?" She nodded slowly, still a little shaken. The room remained quiet for a few seconds before the regulars started whispering, and the jukebox song faded back in. The man and his friends left soon after, avoiding everyone's eyes. When the door closed behind them, the waitress finally let out the breath she'd been holding. The biker looked at her, concern in his face. "Did he hurt you?" She shook her head. "No, just embarrassed me, I guess." He nodded. "You didn't deserve that." "Thanks," she said softly. "For stepping in," he shrugged. "Didn't do anything special." "You did," she said firmly. "Everyone saw it." He looked away, a little uncomfortable with the attention. "Didn't care who saw it," she smiled faintly. "I know." Later, when the bar was empty again, she found him outside, sitting on the steps with a cigarette between his fingers. The night was quiet except for the sound of crickets and the distant hum of a highway. She sat down beside him. "You know," she said softly, "when you told that guy to apologize, the whole place went quiet." He exhaled smoke slowly. "Didn't mean to make a scene." "You didn't," she said. "You just reminded everyone what respect looks like." He looked at her, a small smile touching his lips. "You always see the best in people, don't you?" "Only when it's there to see," she replied gently. They sat in silence for a while, just listening to the night. The air was cool and the stars were scattered across the dark sky. After a long pause, he said quietly, "You know that day when I first came here? When my bike broke down?" She nodded. "Of course," he looked down. "I was planning to leave town after getting it fixed. Didn't think I'd stay a single night more than I had to. And now?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "Now I can't seem to leave." She looked at him, her eyes soft. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing." He nodded slowly. "No, it's not." The next morning, when the sun rose, it painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. The waitress opened the bar early, as always. But this time she wasn't alone. The biker was already there, fixing a loose sign that had been hanging for months. When she saw him up on the ladder, she laughed. "Didn't know you were such a handyman." He grinned. "Guess I'm learning new things every day." She leaned on the doorway, watching him work. "You planning to stay long-term?" she asked. He looked down at her. "Thinking about it. Someone's got to make sure this place doesn't fall apart." She smiled. "Then I guess you're hired." From that day on, the bar felt different, not just to her but to everyone who came in. It wasn't just a roadside stop anymore. It was a place where people lingered a little longer, where laughter came easier. Sometimes the biker would play a song on the jukebox while she worked, something soft and old. The regulars would smile knowingly, and the waitress would just shake her head, pretending not to blush. Life didn't suddenly turn perfect. The bills still came, the roof still leaked when it rained, and some nights were still quiet and lonely. But there was something steady now, something that hadn't been there before. They never talked much about what they were to each other. They didn't need to. It was in the way he waited for her after closing, in the way she saved his favorite cup behind the counter, in the quiet smiles they shared without words. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, the waitress stood outside watching the sky. The biker walked up behind her, hands in his jacket pockets. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said. He nodded. "Yeah, haven't seen skies like this in a long time." She looked at him, then said softly, "You think you'll ever hit the road again?" He thought for a moment before shaking his head. "Not for a while. Think I've done enough running," she smiled. "Good, I was hoping you'd say that." He smiled back, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something he hadn't felt since before the losses and the long roads. Peace. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the lights of the bar flickered on, warm and steady. Inside, the jukebox started another slow song. The biker and the waitress walked back in together, the sound of laughter greeting them as they stepped through the door. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like everything was exactly as it should be.